You're listening to a Thames Estuary Partnership podcast, celebrating London's famous tidal river. We hope you enjoy it.
Hello, I'm Eve Sanders and I'm the Estuary Edges Officer at the Thames Estuary Partnership. Welcome back to our second episode of Talk of the Thames. Now, today I'm joined by Dr. Fiona Haughey, who is a Thames intertidal archaeologist. Now, Fiona certainly knows a thing or two about the artefacts that have been found on the Thames, and today she's going to be talking to us about some of her most exciting finds. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really buzzed to be having this conversation with you because, if I'm honest, I know very, very little about Thames archaeology, but the history of the Thames has always fascinated me a lot, and I'm aware it has a very rich history. So thank you.
It's a pleasure. Always good to talk about the Thames, I think.
Absolutely. You're kind of the archaeological guru, really, for the Thames, aren't you?
I don't think I'd put myself quite that high. I've been working on the Thames for a long time. I think I'm still the only person with a PhD on the Thames, but I came into all that late. I was well into my 40s before I went back and did the undergraduate degree and then a PhD. So I'm probably the only one who's got one at the moment, but I'm sure somebody else will come up with one soon.
That's amazing, though. I mean, to be the kind of first person to have a PhD on, about the Thames is pretty cool.
Yeah.
But on that note, my sort of first question for you really is what inspires you most about working with archaeology on the Thames?
I love the fact that it's constantly changing. I mean, I've done a lot and I still do a lot of excavations that aren't to do with the Thames. I mean, in the summer, normally, I would be working in the Near East for a couple of months just to dry the trench foot out of it that you get occasionally on the Thames. And there it's very typical. You do your square, you dig down, you do things. You can't do that on the Thames. You can't do it. And it's so, you never know what the Thames is going to give you. Even if you went down to the same site 4 days in a row, it won't be the same. And also you have to have a completely different mindset when you're working down there. It's all not in like sort of, Black Forest Gatto layers. You get Mesolithic sitting next door to 1920s material, and it's a whole jumble. And it just never stops giving you stuff. And I just think it's fascinating, and it's been so ignored and so downgraded for years. Even it's long ago, not that long ago actually, in 2000, when there was a volume produced by the Museum of London looking at all the archaeology up to that point that hadn't been published. They put in this big volume, and in the text that went with it, they were constantly talking about finds out of the Thames, but on the maps they didn't put anything that had come out of the Thames on there because they said it wasn't secure, as to exactly where it came from and whatever it is. And that really upset me, because I think, yes, you can, because a lot of stuff it's just literally coming, the surfaces, we don't need to excavate it. It self-excavates itself there. So it removes, and suddenly you've got this collection of something or others, and you're sitting there thinking, where the heck did they come from? It wasn't there yesterday. And it keeps you on your toes all the time. And I have to say, it's a wonderful environment to walk in. If you're feeling really screwed up with stuff, just go for a walk on the Thames foreshore. And that will, mindfulness. It will get your head free, I think. But then you look around and you just see all these little bits and pieces, and they are little bits and pieces. Rarely do we get, certainly up more to central London, you're not going to get the dumps that you do in the outer estuary, where you get, people have been dumping stuff there for years. Further in, it's all small pieces, and trying to put them together is just fantastic.
And the first human kind of evidence of humans around London was 2,000 years ago. Is that correct? I mean, that's a lot of history.
Everybody thinks London started with the Romans. No. I'm a prehistorian. There was a huge amount going on before the Romans arrived. And that's basically what I was talking about in my PhD. We don't have much old Stone Age Paleolithic material, because the Thames was not where it is now in that. It was much further north. And finally, eventually arrived as to where it is now. It got pushed south through the various ice ages. And we get these sort of, which is why if you go to somewhere like Acton, there's a big Paleolithic site there. But you don't have many of that, or very much of that, actually on the current Thames itself. But from, what are we looking at, 8,000 BC to today, we've got evidence of human interaction with the river.
That's incredible.
A lot of it on the islands. A lot of it on the islands we find. We're not looking at complete housing estates or things, but it'll be, you know, when we were into pottery in the Neolithic, we get Neolithic pottery there. We get Mesolithic hand axes there. The thing I've got in my hand, which sadly people can't see, is something that is 10,000 years old.
Goodness me.
In a hand axe, and it fits. It's for a right-handed person. I've showed it to many a left-hander and a right-hander, and they've all tried it, and it is for right-handed people. So it's been specifically done for a right-handed person, and it's got working all over it. This was made at the end of the last ice age, 8,000 BC, and there are lots of these on the river. So it was going before then, way before the Romans arrived, I'm afraid.
It looks so, if I spotted that on a foreshore, I would not think that it would be a hand axe. I'd think it would be a lump of, I don't know, a lump of rock. I mean, how did you discover that?
If you hit flint, which is what this is, in a particular way, you can guarantee it will break in a particular way. If you hit flint, you cause ripples in the flint. And you can see all over this, there's little ripples. And that doesn't happen naturally. And normally, if something is dropped, it'll just break. But this, because if you hit it in a particular way, you can guarantee it will break in a particular way. And this long, thin shape of it is very typical. It's called a Thames Pick, this is known as, very much found in the Thames Valley, this. And you get great big long ones, which are presumably just for show, because if you tried using them, they just break. But this has been clearly used quite a lot. And that I found by dropping a pencil.
Well, as one does, you drop a pencil and you find a hand axe. I mean, naturally.
What we do on the foreshore, when we draw a structure or the distribution of, for example, you know, forest pieces, trees and things, you need to go back regularly with your plan to check what's still there, what's come out. And I was doing that on one particular site, dropped my pencil, bent down, picked it up and thought, just a minute. And there it was, literally between where my feet were, where the pencil had dropped. And
That's incredible.
Yeah.
You must have been very excited. But have you found more than one, or is that quite a rare find?
No, there are a number of them found. And interestingly, there are a number of them found in that particular area. When the Thames was first beginning to be looked at as an archaeological site as opposed to an accidental find, was when we did the Thames Archaeological Survey, which ran in the mid 1900s. 1990s, get it right, I'm not quite that old. And they, from the pilot study was done in 95, and it ran from 96 to 99. And one of the sites we looked at was down in Bermondsey area. And other ones were further up, but on that side, certainly on the Southwark side of the river there. And, you know, by going down and looking at this stuff, regularly and recording what we got there, that was the most important thing, was to record what we had. And anything that stood still long enough got photographed and recorded and everything. And so we got a picture at that point from Teddington Lock, which is where it ceases to be tidal, right the way down to the Kenton-Essex border on the north. That's a long way and a lot of sites. And we each, in order to record the everything that we had, we broke the foreshore down into separate sections. The foreshore officer at that point was Mike Webber, but the rest of us pretty well were doing it as volunteers and things, because it was just so amazing that it finally had got off. And these sections were things like from bridge to bridge or something, so that it was easy for people to know. They were all roughly about 500 metres. So in the area that this was found, the 500-metre section that this was found in, there had been recorded in the past hand axes as well. So obviously not millions, but we don't need millions, you know. And there were lots of other structures on that. There were trees there which I got radiocarbon dated to 3,750 BC.
Wow.
Neolithic, we're looking at there, early Neolithic. And I've also got a structure there that is timbers off a Roman structure too. So we've got, you know, they all look just like wood timbers or bits of trees. But when you start examining them closely, then actually they've got a huge story to tell us as to what was going on, you know.
I mean, you must go onto the foreshore with such a different set of eyes to the rest of us because you kind of know what you're looking for. But even you must get super excited when you discover that kind of age, you know.
A colleague of mine she's the only other person I know who's done a PhD that even vaguely connects with the river, was actually looking at timbers that are found down at Erith just before you hit the Kent border. There are 1,600 trees down there, and she ID'd, because that was her particular specialism, she ID'd all the trees, and they got radiocarbon dates from that as well. So you can actually walk through a prehistoric forest there. And some of these trees, you've just got the root systems. Some of them you've got whole trees where they've fallen over, and some of them on the underside have still got the original bark on them. So I think they go from somewhere like they're slightly more recent than the Neolithic further up. They are, I think, late Neolithic to late Bronze Age, that sort of date, because there's a couple of dates they've got there. But you can normally when we're looking for trees, we look for pollen. But of course, the danger with pollen is that it could have blown in. Whereas here, you've got the actual tree roots and you've got the actual trees still lying there on the foreshore. And that is just amazing. It's not a site we encourage people to go to because it is so deep, deep mud there. It's very difficult, you know. But she did a fantastic bit of work, and she was looking at, she could show how they had, if you like, farmed the trees, chopped them down and made, so you got, if you cut them down, pollard them, and you get, when they grow back, you get these very thin bits that you can weave and stuff. And she's tied some of those in with trackways that have been found on the north side of the river as well. And so you begin to get this link. You begin to jump in and, oh yeah, we've got this here, now we've got that there, now we've got that there. And you begin to get a real picture of what's going on. We never had that before. We never had that before. That's why most people thought it all started with the Romans, because there's so much obvious in front of your eyes Roman stuff. Whereas with prehistoric, it's, you've got to pick a bit here and a bit there and a bit there, you know.
More subtle.
Much more subtle, yeah.
So with carbon dating, that sounds like quite a heavy duty scientific process. What's the kind of basis behind that?
They look at the way the carbon degenerates over time. That's only one tool, because if you've got enough tree rings, you can do tree ring dating, a dendrochronology, which is pretty good, because that will get it down sometimes not just to a year, but to either the spring or the autumn of that year, because that's what the rings will tell you. Radiocarbon dating, you've got to have a big enough sample. It doesn't have to be a lot, but it has to be big. And if, in our case, of course, it's waterlogged, so you've got to have a little bit more and pack it off with water. I mean, I send mine off to a place in Florida, Beta Analytic in Florida, and they will give you an answer back in 6 weeks from there.
Wow, that's pretty quick.
They're pretty quick, yeah. But we use, you know, what means you can. I've had a number of things that have been radiocarbon dated. Most of them that I paid for myself, but others didn't have the cash, so that actually had to go through English Heritage, and that took about 8 months because we were at the back of the queue and we weren't pushing. But again, that was for a skull that was found further up on the river, at a site, again, we don't push people to that site, because you get, where it is on the river, you only get about 3/4 of an hour on the site, because it's you're in front of one of the big houseboat communities, so you're pushed right out into the river. You've got to go at extreme low tides, and you've got to have somebody to watch the turn, because when it turns, you have to get off then. There's no messing around, you have to get straight off. And there was a skull that I'd taken a load of students down with me one day, and we found the skull. And I had to make a decision to lift that, because if you find human material, you have to notify the police, because they have to come and check whether it's relevant to any investigation that they may need to do. The problem was, I knew we didn't have a low enough tide for at least another 3 months. So I'm afraid I did the naughty and I lifted it. Then I told the police.
Uh-oh.
But actually, they were fine. I did get somebody further up the chain from me, I won't give her name away, she actually said, I'll speak to the police on your behalf. So they did. But that came back quite amazing, because that's been dated to, it's Bronze Age in date. But it's actually now on display. I gave that to the Museum of London. It's on display there, because It's got big trepanning. Do you know what I mean by a trepanning?
No. Somebody
deliberately removes a piece of bone from a skull. And this is a hole that's sort of, what are we looking at? 3-4 centimetres across and 2 or 3 centimetres deep. And it's down as the earliest evidence for surgery in London. I have to say, if that's surgery, I don't think I'm quite keen about that.
No, me neither.
It's a gentleman, it's a bloke, you can tell, because he's got good brow ridges here. We ladies have gone beyond being Neanderthals. Men have still got the brow ridges the Neanderthals had. And we haven't got the lower mandible here, we've just got the top bit. But it didn't kill him, because there's about 6-month regrowth on the bone. So that's actually in the Museum of London, in their London Before Londinium gallery.
So people are able to go and see that, myself included, because I would love to see that.
Yeah, you can see that, yes. I did what they call a block lift. We didn't just take the skull, we did a 30 by 30 centimetre block to take everything around it. And when we sieved that, we found a piece of bone in that which fitted into one side. Absolutely. I mean, perfect fit. Both inside and out, it matched. That was the bit we sent off actually for radiocarbon dating. We haven't found any more. There have been other bits of human remains found, near a couple of Neolithic bits and various other things, but the skull, I think, is the most exciting, I think, probably from there.
How did the skull come to end up in the Thames? Do you think that his body was thrown into the Thames? Do you think it's kind of over time it's eroded down into the river? I mean, how's that come about?
It's really funny, because people think everything that's been found previously in the river has come up with the dredgers. And now a lot of it did come, because for about 150 years they were dredging a channel to improve the navigable waterway as you come up. The problem with dredging is, of course, if you do it once, it then slumps in. Then you've got to do it again, and it slumps in, and you keep doing this, and you keep doing this. And the result is quite interesting on the foreshore. But the problem is that people assume that everything came up with dredging. But actually, if you look at the records of things like the Battersea Shield, which people always describe it as having been found, having been dredged. If you've ever seen that, that's actually in the British Museum. There's a copy in the Museum of London, but it's actually in the British Museum. It's the most amazing bit of Iron Age work. And it's got this wonderful sort of glassware on it as well. If that had been dredged, that would have been crushed. That's never been dredged in the month of its life. And if you look at the 2 or 3 lines about the finding of it, it actually eroded out of the riverbank. And actually, it shouldn't be called the Battersea Shield, because it came off the Chelsea side. It should really be called the Chelsea Shield. And my colleagues at Chelsea are very adamant about that, but it'll never be changed. It's always known as the Battersea Shield. But I think this skull has eroded out of the foreshore there. And I think that there have been other Bronze Age bones, but there have been Neolithic. No, we're not talking about vast quantities here, just bits of bone and things. which I think probably it was a grave or something, which is what I think the Battersea Shield was. I think it was a burial because it's such an amazing thing. I don't think it was ever used in battle. I think it was a decoration piece.
Right.
Or somebody had it to show their status.
Yeah.
And I think it's been buried with somebody, which is why it's in such good nick. It's never actually been used. So yes, I think some things are where they've just dropped in. Some things has been deliberately buried. At Bermondsey, we found partial skeleton from sort of the waist up, dated to the 1700s, but she's been deliberately buried there. I think we've got a murder on our hands. Yeah.
That's quite, I mean, terrible, but quite exciting in terms of a find.
Yeah. Because you can see when we did a cross section through, you could see where they'd cut the ground out and put her in. And in the 1700s, it would have been very possible for her just to have fallen off a boat, because the amount of boats in what they call the Pool of London, the bit below London Bridge, which is where all the oceanic vessels coming in and out that needed to to pay dues on all their cargoes. There were so many boats, you could actually walk from one side of the other of the river to the other on boats. It was packed. It could take up to a year to clear customs. That's how long.
Oh my goodness. Okay.
There were so many boats there that somebody could have just accidentally fallen in the water. But this is a deliberate burial. So which makes me think there was a bit more to it than that.
Suspicious. Yeah.
Suspicious, yes.
So on that note, can you tell me what's your most exciting find that you found, and what's the story behind that? Or does the skull come into that?
Well, I think the skull's a good one, because people say, what would you like to find on the river? I'm not interested in weaponry. I mean, not many of the guys are either. It's quite interesting. It's not a guy thing. I think, there's too much of it. I'm not really interested in it. I like it when I have a potsherd of a Neolithic pot, which has got a thumbprint on the inside. Now that puts hairs at the back of my neck up, because that's possibly the only record of that person ever that we'll ever have, is that thumbprint there.
That's hugely exciting.
But you get some things as well that I'm quite chuffed about. For example, we've got, given the state of the country at the moment with COVID and all the medical things and whatever have you, I was quite chuffed to find a little, let me see if I can get it out of my bag, this thing, which probably doesn't look anything to you, but actually it's a glass syringe. And I managed to get hold of one, if I can find one. That was again found in the city reaches, This is another one that I actually got online because I just thought it was quite good, in a wonderful little container. And here's what that originally would have been. That would have been the bit, they've lost the end off there. I haven't, I've still got mine. See, that would go in there. Can you see what it is? It's a syringe there.
Yeah. So what's the date on that, sorry?
Victorian. It's
Victorian. Wow.
Yeah.
And that would have been used for medical purposes?
Yeah, exactly. And that's your pressure thing there. That's this bit here. And you can see it's got the end, the same as that. So that's in there. And this is just to carry it. This is how you do it. You push it out like that. But that's what that is. That's a Victorian one. It didn't come with its case or anything, which is great. But no, that doesn't matter. That just because that's intriguing because of the current situation we find ourselves in. So my best one moves from time to time. You see, I mean, 2 years ago, I do walks for Thames Festival on the river, and one of them, I take people up to Hammersmith, and we found this. Now, this little plate looks quite boring. It's got mud on it that's under the glaze that I can't get off. It's a revolting colour, nice pukey green. The interesting thing is the fact that it's got BBC on it. I don't know whether you can see that. Can you see that?
Yeah, I can.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There you go.
So that is an old-fashioned BBC plate.
Because near Hammersmith Bridge were the Riverside Studios, and in the early 70s, it was the BBC studios.
Right.
And they made things like Z cars. You're far too young to remember that. Some Doctor Who was there and everything. And this, because the symbol for it, their mark there, changes slightly over time. I can tell you that dates to 1978, that plate. And it just is quite fun. It's a bit of fun, that, more than anything. It's about 100 yards down the river from there. We sometimes find the remains of glass beads on the foreshore. And that's very sad, because given the current thing with George Floyd, is it the gentleman, the chap who was murdered, basically?
Yeah.
The building that used to be there on the bank near that where the glass beads are found was where they were making beads for the slave trade.
Okay.
You know, which rather puts people can say yes, no, slave trade in London, it was all going down further down the Thames. No, they were making the beads to go to Africa to buy the slaves to take them over. So it's a very they're interesting to find them, but it's a very cold interest. You know, it brings it. You can't pretend it wasn't happening. You know.
Absolutely. I mean, that's quite a gruesome find, really. I mean, you know, amazing in terms of history, but pretty horrible to know that, you know, like you said, that really puts things into perspective if you're holding that in your hand. Yeah.
I mean, different perspective, but equally a sort of concentrating perspective, as the syringe does. When you think about the syringe, you know, what we're using now and, you know, what they were using those beads for then, it brings a lot of things to home. You can't escape from it. It's still there, you know. So it was quite interesting to get the BBC plate, and that all within, I think, about 150 metres, I think they were. I mean, not at the same time, you know, we found them at different times, but...
Have you ever shown the plate to the, you know, BBC archives or historians? Or
I'm sure they've got some ones in much better condition. Somebody said somebody probably nicked it and then just threw it into the river. Well, we do get a lot of bags that people have presumably snatched from other people, and if there's anything in there that you can begin to identify the person, then it's quite useful to try and give it back to them, because that's something that somebody's stolen, you know.
Yeah.
Sadly, most police now don't handle lost, you know, finds like that. But there was one where there was a card, an Oyster card, and it looked pretty new. So I wandered over the bridge to the nearest tube station and said, you know, I don't know who this is, and they could check. And luckily, that person had registered it, and there was quite a lot of money on it. So I think they were able to, it was a lady, I think they were able to get in touch with her to say that it had been found.
That's incredible.
I think that presumably had come from a theft.
Yeah, but that's kind of lovely that you know, if it was stolen from her, she was kind of thinking that was the last time she was ever going to see her belongings in that bag. So for you to recover it and to hand it back over, that's such a nice story.
Well, yeah, I just think, what would I feel like if it was me, you know? And I don't think I'm the only one with a soft heart, if you know what I mean.
Okay, so that's kind of the bits that you found. I mean, that's such an array of different things. It's amazing to hear. But can you tell me more about some of the sites along the Thames that hold a lot of history?
Yeah, you get places where there's maybe just one thing. You get places where over time there are several things, and the site at Vauxhall is one of them. Currently, you can't get down to that site now because they're doing one of the Tidal Tunnel things is being built near there, one of the entry exit points, so you can't get down to that easily. But I first went down there in 1995, and there were a series of timbers down there, and again, you know, you draw them, you work your way through and you draw it all. And then we put in, we tried to do dendro on it, but it was too fast growing oak. And we got a radiocarbon date. It's Middle Bronze Age, 1750 BC, that. And it's a series of timbers going out in sort of, it's like paired timbers, but sort of alternating as they go out into the river. And the inner set would have produced, it's the substructure, it's not the superstructure. They would have had timbers that crossed. And there's only 2 times really that's used, and one is in the Bronze Age and the other's in the Tudor period, so it was going to be one or the other, but it turned out to be Bronze Age. And there had been found previously, somebody who'd been walking along there had found 2 Bronze Age sort of spearheads as well in the same area. We found a lot of Neolithic artifacts there too. But the other thing that is quite interesting is the fact that the area had adjacent to it, running in and using some of the timbers, we found part of a fish trap. Now, fish traps, which is I bore on ad nauseum in my PhD about these fish traps, there's only so many designs for them. There's only so many ways to catch a fish in the river. And there is only a certain range of fish traps that they put in. And they live trap here. It's not like catching with a rod or something. And one of the typical ones, and that's what this one is here, is a Y-shaped. And what they'd used was that they had used some of the Bronze Age timbers. Now, we've had that radiocarbon dated, and it's Iron Age in date, so it's more recent. And it's one of 2 Iron Age fish traps we've got in the whole of Britain. It's the only 2 that we've got. So we've got one there and one actually on the Severn Estuary there. So that was I found that really very, very interesting because we've got that there. So we've got the full range. We've got Neolithic flints, we've got Bronze Age bridge structure, and we've got Iron Age, all in that, literally on that thing there.
Was that what you did your PhD on then?
My PhD, I particularly looked at the Mesolithic and Neolithic periods. I didn't look at the metal periods, if you like, because everybody puts Mesolithic with Paleolithic and then the Neolithic with Bronze Age. And I'm thinking, hang on a sec. So we start off with people who are hunter-gatherers. There's no metal, there's no ceramics. And then we end up just before metal is introduced, by which time we have got ceramics and people are more settled and the beginnings of agriculture. So you've got that big drift across time. So fish traps was one of the things I looked at.
The wars shaped London hugely. And
you
I think
could also say the other way, that the Thames shaped the wars as well. Have you heard of the phrase bomber's moon?
no.
No, right. Well, the in the whole of the UK was in absolute blackout, at night, so that you wouldn't be able to, they couldn't look at where the cities were and everything. But one thing you can't disguise is a full moon and a river. And the pattern of the Thames would show up like an illuminated map. And so the Germans often used to use the bomber's moon. I mean, we used it the other way going into Germany as well. And sadly, the poor old Thames did us no favours, because they would come in and they knew where they were on the bends on the river. They knew where they needed to go. So I'm afraid the Thames acted as a bit of a traitor during that time, but it couldn't help it, bless it, So they talk about, a moonlit night, talk about it, a bomber's moon. It's known, there's a lot of songs about that sort of thing, But if you go before the World Wars, there was things happening up at Chiswick, because there was particularly one of the boat building yards, because there were many boat building yards, as you can imagine, called Thornycroft. And in the late 1800s, they were commissioned to build torpedo boats there. And also what they call the other side, the destroyers, to destroy torpedo boats, because the Germans had them as well. Now you're talking on quite a narrow stretch of the river, and they also had to close all the river traffic when they got the boats out, because the boats were so big. and eventually they were too big to get out. So Thornycroft actually in 1904, so this is before the First World War, actually relocated to Southampton, and the company that took over started to make all sorts of different things, but a lot of them are military minded. So the river sort of, we're looking at pre even First World War, the river was being used as a place to produce things. You don't tend to think about the Thames being involved in production of destroyers, but actually it was.
That's quite sad to think, really, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. But I think also the access point for the Thames was actually quite good, because you could go up into sort of the North Sea or down through the Channel into the rest of Europe there. Well, not just the North Sea, but also the Baltic, of course, that way, very much. The other thing is this little thing that I've got here. I don't know whether you can see that at all. Can you see that?
I can. So it's like for people listening, it's kind of looks like rock on the bottom and then a sort of pyramid of metal on top, a cone of metal.
It's actually some sort of plastic.
Oh, really? Okay.
I found this on because I was working on one of the open days that the tower occasionally do, that the beach in front of the tower you can't get to. It's forbidden. It's only when they open the gates that you're allowed in that bit there. And along with Thames 21, I was involved doing something there. And we found this. Well, I found that there. I took it off, and somebody identified it initially as a World War II incendiary bomb cap. Well, given how near the tower was to the huge, not that there wasn't the Blitz elsewhere, but even in the Docklands area, it's not surprising. But actually, I've had it now formally identified as what they call a Mark 53, you'll be pleased to note. And it's a fuse bomb, and it's actually inside here is where the fuse would be, inside on that side, and this would hit the ground and it would go off. So that actually would be going down rather than up, if you know what I mean.
But deadly.
Quite deadly. But the really interesting thing about it is that it's an anti-aircraft thing. So it's not from the enemy, it's from our side, so to speak. And apparently the tower had an anti-aircraft unit there. So that would have come from them. So it's one of our boys rather than one of the others, if you know what I mean. But again, it's a bit of stark reality that we needed that sort of things, to go on. Before the boat races, they all of them, they checked the route to see what's on the riverbed, and they did. I think a couple of years ago there was an unexploded bomb there, and
Okay.
There's a lot of unexploded ordnance around the place. For every 1,000 that were dropped, I think it's some quite high number, like 200 or something. Don't quote me quite on that, but it's that sort of huge number. Ones that didn't actually go off, and they're still live. We find in the river bullets and all sorts there, all from the Second World War. Obviously, we had very little coming to the British Isles during the First World War. Occasionally you got, Hartlepool was heavily bombed from the sea during the First World War, but that was unusual. Usually it was all happening on the continental Europe. But you can see places where they were making things, and you get the debris of that on the river. But we do find a lot of ordnance of one form or another around, and people should be careful. You get bullets and all sorts, that people have thrown in,
Yeah. So, that's kind of a stark reminder that it's not kind of safe to just go around looking for these and picking them up. If it's, still live, it could still go off. There is a real danger to that.
There is, in fact, a boat in the outer estuary called the Richard Montgomery, I think, that was an American boat that was sunk, and it is full of ordnance now. And it's been left there because actually, if they disturb it, apparently you could take out something phenomenal in the South End or something, it's so much in there. Even at high water, you still see the masts They're still there. You do get rather stupid people who think it's a bit of a wheeze to go ignore the "you are not allowed" and go and stand on it and have their pictures taken. Well, they could find themselves in a pretty bad pickle, let's put it like that, if it went off. You know?
Them and the rest of Southend, by the sounds of it. So not worth it at all.
No.
Blimey. On the subject of boats, I recently read somewhere that Hitler's forces knew of the huge importance of the Port of London to not only Britain's economy, but many other things, and therefore the docks were a real key target. Does this mean that you would find, it's more likely that you would find key discoveries of weaponry and maybe bombs, that kind of thing, around those areas?
Yeah, I would think so. Yes, yeah. I mean, in fact, Hitler went for, well, whoever was in charge went for all the major ports. I mean, Liverpool took a real hit. Other places where you had ports took real hits. I mean, London did, obviously, but because the double thing with London, of course, was that being the capital city, if you blasted that to Kingdom Come, that would be a big sort of emotional coup for Hitler and for the Third Reich, which could have, it sort of gets rid of your sort of self-esteem as a nation if your capital has been bombed to nothing. When William the Conqueror came, built his Norman, the first castles were built by the Normans. We didn't have castles before the Normans came, and if you look at where the Tower of London is, it's actually the main defences, the Norman defences, are not on the downstream side, but on the upstream side, to protect the Tower of London from the rest of London, because they didn't know whether they would, stand up and fight even more, even afterwards, So it's quite interesting that they were very careful. And you look at the so much of that wall still survives around. It was built first of all the Romans, and then the Normans built on top of it. We've got it, so it does go back to the Romans there. But no, it's an amazing thing.
Absolutely, yeah.
That
really interests me, actually. Just on a side note, I think I think it's so easy to forget what London has been through over the years. And I guess for you, finding these bits and pieces that just look like bits and pieces, but they are such a huge part of history that that to me is incredible. That's so exciting.
Yeah. I can get really excited about a little bit of pottery off something. And people say, well, it's just another bit of pottery, or it's just this, or it's just that. No, it's not, because every one of them, every little bit off that foreshore has got a story to tell. Now, admittedly, some of the stories are a bit more boring than others, but they're still a story. You can look at a tile and say, yes, that went through the Great Fire of London. No, that didn't. That was later, or that was earlier, or something. And you can look at pottery, and you can look at the where Cannon Street Station is now. Used to be what I can only put in terms was sort of like an early version of the EU. There was a thing called the Hanseatic League that was based in the Baltic rivers there, but they actually had bases all over Europe, Northern Europe. They had them up in sort of Norfolk and places like that, but there was a big one. Their main base in Britain was actually where Cannon Street Station is now. And they were allowed, and it was called the Steel Yard, and it's got nothing to do with steel. It was Stahlhof or something. They basically owned it. And the thing that I think is hilarious is that that land was still owned by 3 German cities even to the late 1800s. And it had to be bought from them in order for what is now Transport for London to build their railway station there. So, up until, maybe the 1860s or something, I can't remember the date off the top of my head, but 3 German cities actually owned that land because they were importing. It was an importing thing that they would bring stuff in and sell it. You've heard of stoneware, have you? It's a particular material. You've got ceramics and things, but the really hard one is something called stoneware.
Is that quite gritty in texture?
It can be gritty, yes, and it's very well known for this sort of funny glaze on the outside, and that's when they throw a handful of salt glaze, where it's called, into the kiln, which is very dangerous. They don't do it now, and you get this particular sort of speckling effect. This material, unlike other ceramics, has to be fired at a really high temperature, and it's not just a question of bolstering the kiln up. You've got to do it in a rather particular way. And we couldn't do that in Britain for quite a while. We just couldn't get the technique. So a lot of stuff was coming in from Germany and from France, where they had learnt how to do it. And they were sending that through us into the steelyard. It would come into the steelyard and then it would go out. And the upshot of it is, on the foreshore, all along that stretch there, you find lots and lots and lots of things that have come from Germany, Cologne and various other places. So you've got sort of an early EU going on there. You know, it's all, and the only relic of that you can see, not on the foreshore, is just behind, on the north side where the station is. Just, there's a little pub, but just behind the pub, there's a thing called Steelyard Passage. And that's all there is to show you that was there. And most people wouldn't know. Why is it called Steelyard? We're not making steel here. It's nothing to do with steel. You know.
Do you know, that's interesting, because I think, trust me to say this, but that's now quite a nice wine bar, I think, the Steelyard, just down from Cannon Street Station. And that's crossed my mind before, why is it called the Steelyard? And I presumed because it was once a steelyard. So to know the history, you know, the true history behind that is so interesting.
The pubs themselves some of them are so old. The further down you go, you get the pubs. You've got the Mayflower, which is where the you know, pilgrims actually went from there. They're called, the people talk about them being, is it Portsmouth and no, the other one, Plymouth, that's it. The Plymouth lot, actually they set sail from the Mayflower. And the Americans have recognised that, because for some extraordinary reason, they think it's a privilege, but they've actually allowed them to sell American stamps there. I'm not sure why anybody would want to buy American stamps there, but, but it's, you know, all the pubs down there, they've all got history with them. I mean, long history. The brewery and the manager is sensible. They build on that history, you know, for people go there because of that.
I think that's a kind of opportunity for them to build on that more, really. You don't see enough of that, and it's so, you know, it is interesting. It does draw people in.
And a lot of the pubs were very, because at a time where you couldn't drink water because it wasn't safe, you drank, weak beer initially, which wouldn't be very alcoholic, but and pubs was where a lot of business was done, you know, people, and where the boatmen actually went, the actual rowers and things, they would actually go there to pick up trade and stuff, you know, so they were very, very important, you know.
Yeah, and, you know, they're still important today for different reasons.
I know, they are talking about opening the pubs again, and I think a lot of people have been gagging.
Yeah, nice cold pint. This kind of weather, perfect.
Yeah, it's quite.
Have you got any advice for budding archaeologists or people that want to go away and find out more about the history and the archaeology that's found on the Thames?
I think if you've not been down, I strongly recommend you go to somebody like the Thames Discovery Programme, who actually have built on what we did for the Thames Archaeological Survey. And there are groups of people that actually do go down regularly and check sites and things. I think that's a good way of doing that. Or the other one, they don't, they will do one-off things, but the Thames Explorer Trust do actual walks. I mean, obviously, probably nothing like that's happening at the moment, I would suspect, but it is still there. And to go and have a look round the Docklands, Museum of Docklands, Museum of London at Docklands there. That's always pretty good, because it gives you a taste of that sort of stuff in that area. And I think that's a good starting point if you want to go. The thing for everybody to know, that if you go down onto the foreshore, technically you should have a permit. it used to be that you could go down and just walk along and pick the odd bit up and you didn't need anything for it. But a few years ago, the regulations were changed. So if you want to search, and that means looking down and picking something up, you do need a permit. Now, if you get a 3-year permit, they're not expensive. You know, a 1-day one is, but if you go down for 3 days, and they give you a lot of information there you know, telling you where to be careful of this and be careful of that. You have to be careful of something called Weil's disease down there, which is attractively transmitted in rats' urine, which is why when I take groups down, I always give them gloves and I always do a safety talk. The other thing to do is in September, we are hoping to run some of the walks that we normally do. We don't know yet whether we'll get permission for that, but I think probably we might. But with, you know, social distancing and everything, so I'm going to have to get one of those stupid microphone things.
Yeah.
And it gives you a taste. And also on one of the days, we're hoping to do what we have done over the years, is take people out to some of the islands as well. One of the islands I take people out to here, you can't walk out to it. So we go in kayaks. But the islands themselves are fascinating because most of them have got prehistoric finds from there as well. So look at Thames Festival, see what's going on. That runs for the whole of September. And it's literally, as it says, what it says on the tin, it is focused on the Thames the whole time. So there'll be a lot more information there. If you do go down on the river, don't pick everything up. Look at things. I mean, if you want to bring a memento back, do. But if you take it off the foreshore, what are you going to do with it? It will end up almost certainly in your rubbish bin. And I would rather personally that it stayed in the big rubbish bin on the river so that other people can have a look at stuff as well.
That's hugely important, isn't it? I think, you know, not only to highlight the fact that you do need a permit if you go down, and if you go down to be extra safe, make sure you've got the appropriate PPE, but also if you don't have to take it home, don't, because then it will be there for future generations to look at as well.
Yeah, but do it legally. And then if somebody comes up and says, you know, what are you doing? You can just produce your thing and say, look, I'm covered with this, I'm doing this. And you also, anything that you find that you think is interesting, you need to report your finds to the Portable Antiquities Schemes officer, Stuart Wyatt, who is based at the Museum of London. They may take things in because they want to photograph them, record them, research them, and then they give you them back. It's not, they're not a collection. When they take things in, it's only to record them if they need them, you know.
And I suppose it's important that they're recorded the right way as well. Yeah. So if you do find something, do go and get it registered.
Yeah, I mean, he may look at it and say, actually, it's great, but we don't need to register that. That's fine, but do that rather than just, you know, have it sitting on your shelf.
Fiona, thank you so much for your time. That was so interesting. I definitely learnt a lot, so I'm sure other people did as well.
That's all right.
Thank you for listening to our episode of Talk of the Thames. If you require any more information, please do visit our website at www.thamesestuarypartnership.org. Thank you and take care.